Well, hello, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the engagement manager at SMU DataArts. I'm going to pause for a moment to provide my physical description. I'm a cisgendered African American woman, and I am wearing a white blouse and natural twisted hair, and there is a white blank background behind me. On behalf of our team at SMU DataArts, I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us today for today's presentation. Before I introduce our amazing presenter, I do want to take a moment to introduce two colleagues who will be in the background. We have Rochelle Brisson and Liz Quinn, who will be supporting our webinar space, handling our Q&A and chat feature. As we normally do, we take this time before we kick off a webinar to provide a moment to pause and reflect the Indigenous communities that represent each of our spaces. While we do come today on a virtual platform, we take this moment to acknowledge the lands that we all call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all First Nations people. At SMU Data Arts, we specifically honor the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Cushata, Tonkawa, and the Wichita and affiliated Kichi, Waco, and Taiwanese, and Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU Data Arts now exists. We encourage you to continue to learn about your local communities and how you can support your local Indigenous communities as well. We are sharing a map in our chat feature for you to learn more about the communities that you are a part of. Now, for a bit of housekeeping, we are recording today's presentation, and we will be sure to share that recording with you in a follow-up communications. But that just encourages you to know that we will ask that you remain on mute, and that just encourages the best sound quality for today's session. I do encourage you to stay connected with us and engage with us during our time together. There will be multiple times where we will ask some prompt questions, and you'll use the chat feature to be able to engage and share your perspectives. We do have the Q&A feature available, so feel free to utilize the Q&A to share any questions that you have about today's content. We'll be monitoring those Q&As and sharing them, so it should be a very engaging session. And finally, we do have closed captioning available to you. You'll simply find the CC closed captioning icon on your Zoom dashboard. You'll click that and you may be prompted to select subtitle sections or a transcript. If you have any questions about any of those features within Zoom, just send us a chat and we'd be happy to assist you. And just a final reminder, we are recording today's presentation, so we'll be sure to share that with you and to share with any colleagues who were unable to join us. And with that, I'm happy to switch gears and introduce our amazing speaker. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Zannie Voss. Dr. Voss is the director of SMU DataArts, the National Center for Arts Research, and a professor of arts management at SMU's Meadows School of Arts and the Cox School of Business. She served as the chair of arts management and arts entrepreneurship at SMU for 10 years, and prior to joining SMU faculty, she was a professor at Duke University and the producing director of theater previews at Duke. Zannie has published an array of articles that examine strategic factors and influence organizational performance and leading academic journals in marketing and management. I am excited to introduce Zannie to our screen. Zannie, we're excited to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Hi, everyone. Zannie Voss here. I use she, her pronouns. Uh, my physical description, I am a multiracial woman in her late 50s with dark curly black hair, dark eyes, a silver blue shirt on today that's sleeveless, and I'm in front of a white couch with some striped pillows behind us. Uh, Thank you so much for coming. And I want to extend deepest appreciation, especially to the 20 grantee organization leaders who participated in this effort and contributed their time, their talents, and their candor to this research. Thank you to the FORD team, to Margaret, Rocio, Lane, Lena for their support, their partnership on this limited impact study, and of course to the SMU Data Arts team. So let's go ahead and get started. It kind of makes sense to start a study that's about a funding impact. by acknowledging the reason why the funding program was started in the first place. So what is the context for it? And then kind of what were the assumptions about the kind of impact that it would have and the way that that would be carried out? So at the time that the Ford ACT program was conceived, it was the COVID pandemic, and it presented an existential threat to nonprofit organizations and arts institutions across the country. And arts and cultural organizations play an essential role in our communities, and without intensified support, many organizations would be forced to close for good. It's especially true for arts organizations led by and serving communities of color that have historically been underfunded. Ford's response to that was thinking about, well, then how can change happen? Uh, to address the issues, Ford had a belief that an infusion of capital would help the nonprofit recipients be more resilient and durable organizations, able to provide, to proactively work to build more sustainable and viable operating models. So the America's Cultural Treasures, it's a one-time, two-pronged national and regional initiative to acknowledge and honor the diversity of artistic expression and excellence in America, provide critical funding to organizations that have made a significant impact on cultural landscape despite historically limited resources, and to catalyze a national conversation and increase giving to Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous arts organizations by other donors and funders. With that in mind, this limited impact study focuses exclusively on the ACT national cohort. For them, $81 million in general support funds went to 20 organizations that are significant national anchors for artistic and cultural diversity. It was supported with funding from Ford Foundation and 5 other donors, the Abrams Foundation, the Alice L. Walton Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Tom and Lisa Bullementhal, and Barbara and Amos Hostetter. Grants range in size from $1 million to $6 million for this cohort, representing a significant portion of each institution's operating budget. And each grantee also received up to $100,000 for organizational capacity building, particularly in key areas like digital strategies or in other needs. We gathered data to understand participant priorities, perspectives, and progress on key metrics through interviews. And then we've collected and examined longitudinal data on the finances, operations, and attendance of the ACT grantees and cohort of similar organizations that did not receive funding. And I'll get into that in just a moment. Analysis and findings, we're going to track and analyze the group's operating and financial health. And here are the 20 national cultural treasures. Many of you are here today. The thing is, these organizations truly are exceptional. The 20 grant recipients were selected based on one or more of the following criteria. So thinking about impact, what was the criteria for selection? Nationally or internationally recognized quality in artistic and cultural production and reach, recognized legacy for stewarding and sustaining a cultural tradition rooted in a community of color, significant legacy of impact over more than 2 decades, leadership as a training ground or a school for several generations of artists and arts leaders, and recognition as an indispensable hub for a larger network of allied organizations. So here's the study's timeline. I'm going back to 2019 with a purpose. We study organizational data starting in 2019 to get a look at change from the time before the ACT funding was received. So to assess impact, typically we want to look before, during, and after the funding happened. So there we have 2019, there's pre-COVID time, there's operating, financial, and attendance data that you'll see on both the ACT and 2 other cohorts. 2020 COVID strikes, spring 2020, the killing of George Floyd, among many others, starting in May 2020, really kind of changes the landscape of a sense of equity and racial justice in the country. Ford announces a social bond offering in June of 2020, $85 million from the proceeds of Ford's historic social bond offering. Initial funding was received by some organizations in December of 2020. And again, we have the operating and financial data. 2021, we started interviews, which were intended to document each organization's top goals, its operating and financial priorities that supported those goals, a description of the strategies that they employed to advance the goals and priorities, and the internal and external elements that they perceive as having impact or inhibiting or accelerating their success, as well as their outlook on the future. These interviews were conducted with the person ultimately responsible for setting priorities and the person accountable for organizational performance, recognizing that in these different organizations, that person may hold a variety of position titles. And we left it up to each grantee organization as to whether or not they wanted to invite other staff members to join the interviews. Uh, in 2022, again, financial and operating data and the balance of funding received by the majority of organizations. In 2021, initial funding was received by organizations that hadn't received it, an initial payment in December of 2022. In 2023, we see interviews again in January through March, the financial and operating data, balance of funding received by several grantees, and this interim report. So ACT participant top goals, that's really a great place to start. Um, Organizations had a variety of goals, but they tended to cluster in kind of these 6 big bucket areas. Expand and elevate excellence, preservation, and national and international leadership in artistic and education programs. Amplify and promote cultural identity, raise awareness, take control of the cultural narrative. Preserve cultural heritage, rewrite American cultural history. Reckon with structural racism in society, confront injustices, heal communities, increase opportunities for artists and arts leaders of color, deepen community impact and participation, broaden impact nationally and globally, strengthen infrastructure, including facilities, digital infrastructure, shifting operating models, human resources, planning for long-term financial stability, and succession planning. Again, we did interviews in 2021 as well as in 2023. Top goals remained fairly consistent since 2021. Of the 20 organizations, only one arts leader spoke to having different goals now than they had in 2021, which is really the result of their strategic planning process. 13 of the 20 have the same top goals exactly. 6 have the same goals, but they've been reordered, added to, modified slightly to correspond with new circumstances, which were broadly acknowledged as being sparked by the exceptional support, both from Ford as well as from Mackenzie Scott. By and large, the 20 organizations report that they have made progress towards their goals since 2021, and that's as of the 2023 first quarter interviews. So Monica, do you want to pause for a brief chat?
Absolutely. As we shared at the top, this is our moment to pull out that keyboard and chat with us. So if you could take a moment to share if these goals still resonate with you. For our ACT participants, do you still feel yourself connected to these priorities? And if you could share a little context in our chat. As you're sharing in the chat, we encourage you to use the drop-down menu to chat with everyone, and you're also welcome to introduce yourself as well. I'm sorry I missed that point. So if you could share who you are and your organization and where you're coming from in the world, and provide if these goals still align with how you're working in your organization currently. We'd love to hear.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks everyone. I know a lot has happened since the first quarter of 2023, so really just interested to see kind of a finger on the pulse of where your thinking is now. While you're contributing there, I'm going to go on to say that these top goals are all undergirded with financial and operating priorities. So we asked everyone what's needed and what matters most to you in terms of operating and financial priorities, given what your goals are. Uh, Participants' articulation of priorities is really what's guiding this limited impact study of their path through the ACT grant term. It's not that Ford said, we're looking for this kind of performance. It's the grantees said, these are the types of performance that are priorities that are important to us in order to achieve our goals. So although nearly all grantees' top goals remain stable from 21 to 2023, their financial and operating priorities kind of changed over time. The order of priorities was shifted, new ones emerged, some were accomplished, so they were no longer a concern. It's partly a reflection of external influences on the organization's changed circumstances. And partly it's just capturing a moment in time as they build the underlying financial and operating infrastructure necessary to take the next step advancing objectives. So we can see here that balancing program growth with staff growth, kind of a metric of sufficiently resource staff capacity. It was the most frequently mentioned priority in both 21 and 23. It was followed by a level of support from individuals in 2023 and diversification of revenue streams in 2021, which we'll address in just a few moments. Support from both individuals and grant makers took on greater importance over time. Interestingly, both revenue diversity and increasing earned revenue were far lower priorities in 2023 than in 2021. And perhaps it's just living with the reality of what's happened as doors have been opening. Numerous arts leaders recounted how they invested their Mackenzie Scott funds to establish or to add to endowments. Subsequently, growth in investments and endowments has become a higher priority over time. The greater connection to individuals in terms of community engagement remains top among priorities. So understanding ACT grantees' starting place of trends for 2019 through 2021, a primary question for this limited impact study was whether the ACT cohort's operating and financial health on these priorities improved over time. So I'm going to share trends on the grantees from 2019 through 2021. It's what we have data for. 2021 is actually the most recent annual data that's been provided by all of the ACT organizations. In a couple of years, we're going to be able to tell what the ripple effect of Ford ACT funding on these exceptional organizations in subsequent years. And you may be saying, well, that was a long time ago. But for now, a look in the rearview mirror actually provides context for the strengths and the underlying challenges that organizations are experiencing today. It's to tee up or looking at this starting place, heading into the first flow of ACT funds. And it serves as a benchmark for the future. I mean, we just saw the ACT participants' priorities, so I'm going to take those priorities just a little bit out of order in terms of what their ranking was, so they hang together better in terms of the storytelling, but I'm going to cover them. But first, I want to just share a couple of pieces of information about basic characteristics of the comparison cohorts and the Ford cohort. So here you have a breakdown by arts and cultural sector of the 20 organizations, what their 2019, so in a normal year, what was total expenses, in-person attendance, average employees and board members, and then from 2019 through 2021, what was the inflation adjusted change in total expenses? We're going to look at a couple of cohorts, and I'll tell you why. We typically set up a comparison cohort, like a single comparison cohort, with really strongly similar traits who didn't receive funding to tell whether there are significant differences in performance. Think of it as like drug trials, where participants are the same, one received the treatment and the other one didn't. We searched and researched. The thing is, Ford identified cultural treasures who are truly exceptional and without a single peer cohort across all traits in all of the data that we have. So we did our best to find actually two cohorts that are similar to ACT organizations, but in different ways. Both comparison cohort groups exclude ACT grantees. And for both, we put cutoffs in terms of budget so that they'd be in the same budget range, lowest and highest, as the ACT cohort. The first group is a group of BIPOC organizations. So these are organizations that are like ACT organization in that their mission is rooted in an explicitly identified ethnic or cultural voice, whom we're going to refer to throughout the presentation as BIPOC. They tend to have, you'll see down here, smaller budgets, slightly fewer employees, fewer annual participants in programming, and a whole lot more community-based and arts education organizations rather than museums, which you see in the ACT cohort. They scaled back operations to a lesser extent in the ACT organizations in 2021 as compared to pre-pandemic year. The second cohort is a group of what I'm going to call non-BIPOC organizations. Their mission is not rooted in a specific cultural voice. In many ways, ACT organizations tend to be more like organizations whose mission is not rooted in an explicitly identified ethnic or cultural voice, who operate actually in really similar arts and cultural sectors to the ACT cohort. Even though the budget ranges were the same, this group had slightly lower average expenses, slightly fewer attendees, but They've got slightly more full-time employees and board members, and they scaled back operations to a slightly greater extent than ACT organizations during the pandemic. So let's dive in. Here we see over time that the ACT cohort's in-person participation losses were really not dissimilar to that of organizations in the other two cohorts. Um, what's kind of interesting is that, in fact, the BIPOC cohort over here actually continued to serve more in-person participants than either the ACT or non-BIPOC organizations in 2021, even though they had lower average attendance at the start of the period. When we fold in virtual attendance at digital programming, it appears that BIPOC organizations, whether part of the ACT cohort or not, reported explosive growth in virtual offerings and participation during the pandemic. They did an incredible job of engaging attendees and other participants when doors were closed. One could hypothesize that it just all depends, this attendance, on how many offerings, digital offerings were made available. And so we looked, and all three cohorts provided fewer than 10 digital programmatic offerings in 2019. By 2021, non-BIPOC organizations averaged 80 digital programs. ACT organizations offered 104, and BIPOC organizations 131. So a difference about 25 programs, of about 25 programs in each case. It's really interesting that the differences, though, in virtual participation levels are not nearly as evenly distributed. There's a huge jump between the 9 BIPOC cohorts and the other two cohorts. It really serves, I think, as a testament to the profound sense of relevance found in the programmatic offerings of BIPOC organizations in particular. Individual support and budget growth. We see here that actually budgets didn't grow. Evidently, it's tied to the pandemic, so it's not really necessary to go into why did total expenses decline. But let's focus instead on the individual support. So we're looking at support both from trustees and from non-trustee other individuals. It soared from 20 to 21 for the ACT cohort. This is the year of big forward investments as well as Mackenzie Scott funding. 61% more donors gave 193% more in support. And I'm just curious, if you wouldn't mind, if you are an ACT grant recipient, if you could just share in the chat, if you received Mackenzie Scott funding, did you count it as individual contributions or as foundation funding? Knowing that it came from donor advised funds, it seems that there's a bit of variability in terms of where that showed up. I want to point out that we actually see this similar picture of stupendous growth in individual contributions, whether we look at the mean or the median. So it isn't a phenomenon that's driven just by one or two outliers. So was this the case for everyone or just for ACT organizations? When we look at the other two cohorts, we see that the exceptional growth was unique to BIPOC organizations, whether ACT participants or not. There was 193% individual contributions growth, as you saw on the last slide, for the ACT cohort, but BIPOC organizations had 147% growth in individual contributions. They started it at a really low level, so the 147 may not feel like that much in terms of the percent of expenses that it covers, but it was real and it was there. The non-BIPOC cohort actually had a shrinkage of 8% of individual contributions. Let's think a moment. Is this just because we said they had 61% more donors? This is really kind of explosive growth. Let's dig into that a little bit more. So we decided to probe not only dollars, but donors. ACT organizations had really similar average number of individual donors in 2019 and 2020. The ACT cohort increased their average number of individual donors for both 2020 and for 2021. They really set themselves apart in 2021. Their 193% individual contribution growth, again, driven by 61% more donors over time who gave larger average gifts. For non-BIPOC cohort, the gray line, they had 6% lower support from individuals and reported an average 7% increase in the number of individual donors from 2019. So basically more individuals giving less during the pandemic. Organizations in the BIPOC cohort had a 147% increase in individual support from 18% fewer donors. So over time, fewer people gave more. Again, could be related to Mackenzie-Scott effect. We don't have the detail of the why behind the change there. Specifically, because this was stated a priority, we looked at board participation in giving, and the ACT organizations improved on the percentage of board members who donate, whereas board participation giving levels dropped from a high of 2019 for the other two cohorts. So board participation in giving, though, was actually lower for BIPOC organizations. We see across the board for both the ACT cohort and the BIPOC cohort, only hovering at like 73, 74% versus 92% for the other group. Having that said, I want to acknowledge that smaller organizations tend to have board members who contribute their skills, their network, their knowledge. They're not necessarily a fundraising board with set giving expectations. What's kind of interesting, though, as similar as the ACT cohort is to the non-BIPOC organizations in terms of budget size, it appears that in 2021, at least, the ACT organization board still tended to donate less than the non-BIPOC cohort. So let's shift to one of the big areas was grant maker support, and we're going to break that into foundations and government. The impact of the Ford ACT funding was phenomenal. It was an immediate game changer. The 2021 amount of average foundation funding alone exceeded the average ACT national cohorts organization's level of total expenses. The comparison to the other cohorts really just drives home this point. Ford funding set ACT organizations apart. The grantees average support from 26 foundations each of the 3 years, so we can really state with confidence that the ACT funds had exceptional impact. The number of foundations providing support to organizations in the BIPOC cohort rose 14% from 14 to 16 foundation funders, and foundation dollars were 36% higher. By contrast, the number of foundations providing support to the non-BIPOC cohort actually dwindled 61% from 47 in 2019 to 21 in 2020 and 19 in 2021. Their foundation support was 16% lower over time, which, given that cut, isn't that surprising. In terms of total government support, we see government support increased 57% for the ACT cohort. But as we compare to the other cohorts, we see that despite growth in government support, the ACT cohort really lags behind peers. They're the orange line down here in this area. BIPOC organizations more generally perform exceptionally well with government support, particularly with covering expenses with state and local support. Given their comparatively low access to individual and foundation support, as we saw in these earlier charts, government support is really essential to their survival. Organizations of every ilk saw double-digit growth in federal government support in 2021, with the major national relief programs of PPP, SVOG, American Rescue Plan. The federal funding to ACT organizations was widely realized across organizations, again, evidenced by the fact that the mean and the median were really, really similar in both years. Another key area to investigate was revenue diversity. This was a priority. It really wasn't a big strength of the ACT cohort heading into the program. The ACT cohort's revenue diversity was kind of similar to the non-BIPOC cohort in 2019, but without as much investment revenue. By 2021, the ACT cohort, as well as the BIPOC cohort, both had contributed revenue accounting for 83% of their total revenue. And we see here down in the non-BIPOC cohort, they had higher investment portfolios than BIPOC peers. greater revenue diversity was the case for the ACT and the BIPOC, other BIPOC organizations. I think what we're seeing here is it appears that some of the non-BIPOC organizations with large endowments took a larger than usual draw in 2021 to offset the loss of earned revenue in particular. So having that investment resource really was a saving grace for offsetting some of the challenges that were happening with respect to earned revenue. But let's look at this because I think that the equation is a little bit more complex than that. 2021 was such a pivotal year. It's not just about revenue diversity. What we really see is that in 2021, the ACT organizations managed revenue diversity goals and revenue growth simultaneously. They had explosive growth in total revenue. The ACT cohort averaged a tripling of average contributed revenue, more than doubling of investment income. There was a 79% drop in earned revenue, but it came up to 64% total revenue growth. That's $17 million in average revenue in 2021 on an average budget size of only 6.9 million. And so what happened with all these funds? We see it appear in two different ways. We see it in working capital. So what did they do with the windfall? Working capital and investments. So working capital, it's a measure of liquidity. It represents unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day needs. Months of capital, working capital, it's a useful metric just of interpreting how long an organization would be able to survive at its current expense size in the absence of revenue. So it's unrestricted current assets minus current liabilities divided by expenses, and then you multiply that out by 12 months. ACT organizations had significantly more months of working capital in 2021. And we see that investments grew. For the ACT cohort, they grew in total 55%, largely due to growth in unrestricted investments. Those are the orange slices of the columns. In 2021, this 13.3 million, again, the year of the infusion of most of the Ford funding and Mackenzie Scott funding. Overall growth for the non-BIPOC organizations was only 23%. So you'll see here in 2021 that the ACT cohort's average total investments nearly caught up to those of the non-BIPOC cohort, largely due again to the growth in the unrestricted investments. You don't see the BIPOC cohort investments here just because they did grow 40% over time, but they were just 2 million in 2021 after that growth. So it's not a similar scale of the other two cohorts to really be able to see the visual contrast here. I'm going to look at staff capacity. Doing a comparison of program growth to staff growth at a time when many programs weren't offered didn't really feel like a useful trend to report on at this time. However, I did want to share information about staff growth so that we know what was the precursor trend as ACT was being launched. And we see that ACT organizations kept full-time staff and reduced part-time staff, and that they were kind of in the mid-range in terms of staff levels and staff reductions over time. BIPOC organizations held on to their staff, both full-time and part-time. And interestingly, the non-BIPOC organizations cut their staff, both full-time and part-time, despite incentive to keep employees on payroll through the federal payroll protection program. I'm going to take a brief pause there. Now that we've explored these trends, Monica, I'm going to let you take it for just a moment and see what folks have to say.
Absolutely, Zannie. I'm really curious to our audience. Zannie's walked through these amazing comparable trends, and I would encourage you to share if any of these trends are interesting to you, or anything that caught your eye that you would want to share in the chat to continue this conversation. Zannie, I also want to share that we've had a very active chat. A lot of folks have been able to respond to some of our questions. So we did start and jump off our conversation in the chat, asking folks, particularly the ACT grantees, if their goals were still resonating with what you shared earlier. And a few folks said that these goals still connect to the work that they're doing. I wanted to call out greetings and hellos from Seattle's Chinatown, and they shared that both they lift up and highlight their cultural and social assets as strengths as they continue to face existential threats, which is a really interesting topic as we transition to the next phase of this work. You also posed a question about the McKinsey Scott funding, and we did see that two of the organizations shared that they listed it as foundational giving. And then we also had an organization shared as individual support. So I want to encourage everyone to continue to share in that chat feature as folks are talking about the trends that are highlighted that are interesting to them. I see a response now with a question. Zannie, are you okay to answer a question with us?
Sure, if I can.
It's interesting to see the difference of government support to BIPOC versus the cultural treasures. I'm wondering why that is. Was there any information or context as to why?
We don't have any context other than to say that for the BIPOC organizations, it tends to be local and state funding that really drives the high levels. Um, I can't say why the ACT organizations tend to receive less than other BIPOC organizations. Typically, as organizations grow, the government funding tends to account for less of their total support. It could be just less so of being BIPOC than it is of being of a certain budget size. But it's a great question for us to probe in the future. So thank you for posing that.
And that came from Emily. We appreciate that question. Zani, as folks
Right.
continue to share the trends that bring up questions, I want to shift it back to you to continue walking us through the report.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you. And please do continue if you have questions. I'm happy to try and answer them when we wrap up here. Here we're going to be looking ahead, and this section focuses on what the leaders of ACT organizations conveyed in the interviews that were conducted in the first quarter of 2023. This was kind of an interim check-in regarding perceptions, progress, and the future. One of the things we explored was, what are the external threats? What are the things about the environment right now that make it really hard for you to achieve your goals uh, and priorities? And here we show the most frequently referenced external headwinds. Inflation, stock market volatility. Some who said they had just gotten the huge Ford and McKinsey Scott funding, had invested some of the McKinsey Scott funding at the moment when the stock market started to tank. And so it was losing value immediately, and that sense of crisis. Funding competition from white institutions. I just want to share a quote. We're seeing greater competition from ballet because predominantly white companies have gotten hip to the fact that there are Black audiences and dancers. Theirs is a place of opportunity, not mission. We need urgency around the telling of our story and our origins so that our place in all of that doesn't get erased. Organizations speaking to audiences not returning to pre-pandemic levels in some cases. A sense of a lack of sustainable funding and concern that the attention that was given to BIPOC organizations during this time of racial justice awareness may shift as kind of public attention moves away from the immediacy of the inequities. And then similarly, racism, polarization, societal strife. We looked at internal challenges as well, and top internal challenges varied considerably, but there were 9 kind of recurring themes that emerged in 3 broad categories, the biggest of which related to staffing. Similar internal staff and infrastructure challenges were identified by participants in both 2021 and 2023. What changed was their context. Most organizations' staff and budget size increased over the past 2 years. Many folks spoke to human resource systems as being a challenge. They had a real need for more formal systems and professional development. Uh, Here's a quote. We are experiencing growing pains in systems, creating systems, processes, procedures for a first time for a growing organization. We're the same, but we're different operations wise. It takes more interdepartmental coordination. Perhaps that's something that several of you who are from the ACT organizations share. This emphasis on staff related challenges, it underscores the articulation of balance between programmatic growth and staff growth as a top priority that we had seen above. Organizational capacity more broadly, the sense of burnout, under-resourced staff, low pay, trying to do too much, too many programs with too few people. and an inability to attract and retain talented employees, and the need for more professionals. Arts leaders recognize that these ambitious goals can't be achieved if they don't have adequately resourced staff in place to carry them out. So while some organizations have been increasing staff levels and are contending with challenges related to cultural change. So for culture change, we saw challenges related to desiloing up, departments, shifting the culture post-pandemic as people are continuing to work remotely and indoctrinating new employees as the staff members are still working remotely. Generations don't share the same perspectives on work-life balance across the board. And then we heard about the emotional toll of organizational and societal issues affecting staff and leaders personally. We're at a moment for BIPOC leaders who've worked through trauma, the pandemic, and are now asked to continue to lead at that level. I talk with my colleagues, until we do something, we're going to see a big departure. Folks are exhausted. I've been through 3 transitions with staff already, and it takes a toll. Another big area was infrastructure. Challenges about infrastructure needs, how to balance digital in-person programming post-COVID was top of mind. Challenges related to facility, need for facility repairs, lack of adequate space, investments needed post-COVID, and things like HVAC requirements. Infrastructure capacity to invest in even greater artistic, scholarly, and programmatic excellence. So not just physical assets, but infrastructure to invest in the programs. And board development needed, particularly as organizations were growing in size. Another big area was identity transition. Some arts leaders identified that they were changing mission while remaining faithful to a community through this period of change and growth. This is really exemplified in a couple of quotes. When you're a certain scale, there are financial pressures to do things that require corporate sponsorships and individual wealth. The mix of community participation and focus can be diminished. For an organizations that are about a particular culture, it's a danger to be disconnected from the community. And being faithful to our community, we'll be making some changes to the mission statement. It's something sensitive. We need our relevance to grow and the mission to grow with it. We need the change to change. We need the change to change our fundraising strategy to bring in more income with the expansion of mission. And because culture was brought up so much, organizational culture in both 2021 and 2023, we probed that a bit further and said, has your culture actually changed since 2021? It was identified as a key success factor and an internal threat. So we decided to probe it further. And 65%, or 13 of the 20 organizations, reported that they have the same culture now as they did in 2021. And they were described it as a passion for the mission, excellence, leadership, it's participatory culture, collaborative community, family. 5 organization leaders, or 25%, say that their culture is in the process of changing, and 3 of the 5 attribute the change to staff growth and perception shifts about work-life balance. For these organizations, descriptors were respectful and tolerant, less siloed, a place for self-starters. 2 participants, or 10%, reported that organizational culture had definitively changed since 2021, with a mixed bag of positive and negative traits. Some are proud, committed, but there's also uncertainty, discomfort, people are fatigued, and they're irritable. A lot to contend with along with organizational growth is how do you create a positive culture that can sustain the goals that you're trying to achieve. So in summary, here are some key observations. Again, ACT organizations form an extraordinarily unique cohort. Ford ACT support showed early signs of significant impact on numerous financial and operating priorities that support organizational goals, such as exceptional individual growth. It was unique to BIPOC organizations, whether ACT participants or not. However, only the ACT cohort attracted many more donors. The ACT cohort lacked revenue diversity pre-ACT, but I think we're going to see that this huge revenue growth and growth in investments is likely going to mean future revenue diversity that's more similar to that of non-BIPOC organizations. So kind of playing that forward. The ACT organization's working capital uniquely soared in 2021, and it had exceptional growth in unrestricted investments in particular. So average total investments nearly catching up to those of the non-BIPOC cohort. And the funding created a really distinctive, explosive increase in the cohort's overall foundation support. And it'll be interesting to see going forward whether the increase in the number of donors is sustained over time. And in the first quarter of 2023, 90% of ACT participants said that they were mostly very optimistic, confident, and hopeful about the upcoming year. But in 2021, impact was yet to be felt in a number of other prioritized ways. So despite growth in government support, the ACT cohort actually lagged behind peers in government support, to Emily's point, um, whereas the BIPOC organizations more generally perform exceptionally well on this measure. ACT organizations improved on the percentage of board members who donate, but there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in this area. BIPOC organizations, whether ACT or not, so it's not unique to this cohort, they kept communities engaged during the pandemic, which is really a critical factor that's surfacing in a lot of research as a key predictor of post-pandemic attendance and participation. Organizations that tended to stay shut for a longer period of time and not engage communities are having the hardest time now of being able to get people to come back in person. ACT organizations cut part-time staff on average, but kind of similar to the non-BIPOC cohort. And they held on to full-time staff, which was kind of similar to the BIPOC cohort. So it's neither good nor bad. It's just saying it wasn't unique. There was widespread concern related to human resource systems, organizational capacity, organizational culture, insufficient infrastructure, and growing pains related to mission. They're considering what talents they need, how to attract and retain talent, what more bus departments and leadership structures look like. And in 2023, organizational growth was expressed repeatedly, that it was a growing concern. People acknowledge that they're struggling to figure out the right organizational structure and the right staff size to ensure the smooth running of now larger operations with more programming. How to hold on to the growth that was attained, how to hold on to the sense of growth, not just in expenses, but in contributions, and to deal with the equation of people coming back to in-person programming. What the future holds will be seen in the next update. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone again for the time and the attention today. We're happy to share out the slides from today's presentation. And I also want to just invite if there were any more questions about anything that was presented, or just general reflections you have about this particular cohort and the comparison cohorts. I'm happy to respond. I'm also interested, for those of you who are affiliated with some of the regional cohorts, if you're seeing within your own regions some similar trends to what we found with the ACT cohort. Monica?
Yes, Zannie, it seems that government support conversation really provided a little bit of context for some of our folks in the chat. There seems to be a there with identifying a curiosity if government support in the study, if there were grants or if they were CDS earmarks. So there's an assumption that they're grants, but curious to see how much that support impacts the cultural treasures. But a good conversation was happening in the chat about that.
A thought that just occurs to me is, we saw when we were describing what are the differences across these different cohorts, that there were far more community-based and arts education organizations in the BIPOC cohort than there were within ACT. So I wonder if there weren't particular earmarks that were made for community-based organizations and arts education organizations that weren't necessarily at the local and state level, that weren't necessarily available on a broader basis to the sectors that are represented in the ACT cohort. We can certainly examine that. Like, of the BIPOC organizations, does it vary by sector in terms of the level of expenses that are covered by local, state, and federal funding? Great, great thing to note.
Well, Vonnie, I don't see any additional questions at this point in time, but I do want to share a reminder with our ACT organizations that the Cultural Data Profile is excited to receive new data. So we encourage you to drop your 2022 data into the CDP so we can continue learning. It looks like we did get a new comment. There is one from Neil, who shared that at the beginning of the pandemic, very few of the local and state funders funded art organizations at all. And that was just a comment that Neil wanted to share for us. And Emily asked a question about the data. Is that going to be shared with other donors?
The which data, Emily, will be shared with other donors? You mean the data from this report, will it be shared with anyone other than Ford? Is that the question?
Yes, this content that we talked through today.
Um, I will give an update on that once I speak with the team at Ford.
So there's more to come, Emily. Will have more information to be able to clearly answer that question.
Yeah.
But with that, it seems as though that is all of our questions, Zani. I think you did a wonderful job providing us a journey through the work that we've done thus far. I also wanted to share our extreme thanks to all of you for joining us for an hour to learn more about this presentation, and for all of your questions and all of your context that led this presentation to kind of live in a different way. Again, we will just stay on this webinar space for just one more second, but we are going to conclude our time together. But we do want to share our extreme appreciation to you joining today.